Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the great patriarchs of the Jewish faith. Now, Isaac is a somewhat passive figure in his own story. After all, he is the potential victim of his father's command to offer him as a burnt offering. And he remains at home while a servant is sent to procure a wife for him. So it is as if Abraham has filled out an order and sent it with a servant. One wife, Aramean, so tall, everything else. Now Abraham and Jacob are a little more active in their roles. Jacob, we will read later, is renamed Israel, which means to struggle with God and to have God and angels and to have prevailed. Jacob will become the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. But neither Abraham nor Jacob are people that we would call moral standards. Yet this is a theme in the Old Testament. God doesn't call perfect people. God doesn't call perfect people to do God's work. But the people say, thank God. Thank God. The biblical story tells us that God calls liars, cheats, prostitutes, and murderers. God doesn't call perfect people to do God's work. In the biblical story, God calls people who are more flawed than even you and me. At the time of his call, Moses had already murdered an Egyptian. He was on the run. King David, you remember, had Uriah the Hittite murdered. Yet God did not remove King David from his kingship. God didn't reject him. And it was a prostitute who harbored the Hebrew spies when they crawled over the wall of Jericho before the siege. Now these aren't cute, nice little incongruities. This is the character of the God of the Hebrew people. This is the God of Jesus of Nazareth. This is the God of Jesus whom we call Christ. And Jacob is just one in a long line of unexpected people who do God's work. People who are not moral exemplars. This should make us a wee bit more comfortable. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac. And Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah. Rebekah was the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean, of Paddan Aram, sister of Laban, the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. Now, I grew up in cities and suburbs. Perhaps it was Santa Fe, New Mexico, which was around 35,000 when we lived there. That was the smallest city or suburb that I lived in growing up. And most of my adult life was spent in similar situations. So in these situations, a person's genealogy didn't matter because, well, when I was growing up in Houston, Houston was full of transplants. The joke was that the most difficult thing to find in Houston was a native Houstonian. So you didn't know people's genealogies. You didn't know people 2 or 3 generations back. There was a woman in my church in Wheatland who would refer to, it's easier to use the names, she would refer to Judy Bodecker as Judy Cassad. Judy Cassad was her maiden name. And Judy and Owen Bodecker had been married 40 years. One day after this woman did this, I went up to Owen and said, you know, you got to marry her and make an honest woman out of her. But even I did this same thing when I found myself in my last few years in Wheatland referring to a woman by her maiden name. And I had even conducted her wedding. So we do this sort of thing in rural Iowa. We know people's families and generations, 2 or 3 generations back. So unlike our urban and suburban counterparts, sometimes the Bible is a little bit more familiar to us because the Bible will establish somebody's credibility based on who they are, who their family is. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Paddan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. So the Bible storyteller is telling us that Rebekah comes from the right stock, that she is an Aramean. And Abraham was an Aramean when God called him. So the bottom line of this particular paragraph is that Rebekah is acceptable. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. Now the biblical writers had the idea of conception all wrong. Understandably wrong, but even so, all wrong. But their idea of conception was understandably informed by the agriculture that they saw all around them. That is, a seed was planted in the ground and it grew. So their idea of conception was that a man provided the seed and the woman the fertile soil. Now, if the couple had no children, the soil was believed to be infertile or barren. So always in the biblical story, it is the woman who is described as barren. So we hear of Rebekah that she was barren. Now there are a few things that are going on in this particular twist in the story. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, and his wife Rebekah conceived. This is, in a sense, an affirmation of faith. Because it seems as we read the story of Abraham, and as we read the story of Abraham, which is the entire Old Testament, and we could take that even into the generations of Jesus of Nazareth, that the promise that God made to Abraham is always at risk. God makes a promise to Abraham that he will have more offspring, more generations than the sands by the sea, than the stars in the sky, and yet Abraham and Sarah have trouble conceiving. And finally, it is God who provides the child, Isaac. Then Isaac and Rebekah have trouble conceiving, and finally, Isaac's prayers are answered. When the promise is at risk, pray to God. This is what the storyteller is telling us. When the promise is at risk, pray to God. All around the people of Israel, there was worship of gods of fertility, but the storyteller is telling us that it is God alone who is responsible for the birth of children. God is responsible for the fulfillment of the promise. God is responsible for the fulfillment of God's promises to you and me. The children struggled within her, and she said, "If it is to be this way, why do I live?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger." When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body with a hairy mantle. So they named him Esau. Afterwards his brother came out, with his hand gripping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Now once when Jacob was cooking a stew. Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. And he said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is my birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him, and he sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank, and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now, Deuteronomy 20:15-17, this is part of the law. It states that the firstborn son gets a double share of the inheritance. So whatever Isaac's wealth, the one with the birthright, Esau, would have gotten 2/3 of that wealth. Now, our story takes place before this law was set down, but even so, this law probably arose from custom, and Jacob would have upheld this custom. He would have given 2/3 of his wealth to Esau. We've probably seen something like this around here. When a dad dies and someone inherits the farm. And I'll bet that more often than not, it's the oldest son who inherits the farm. Unless, of course, the oldest son just doesn't want the farm, but that isn't his thing, it isn't in his genes. But I bet that it's not unusual around here for the oldest or only son to take over the farm when dad dies. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Now, each of these names has a Hebrew root in it that means something, and Esau has a root that means red, which is also the same root in the word Edom. But the word Jacob comes from the root for the word heel. And we can think of that the same way we use the word heal these days. As the saying goes, time does not wound, all heals. Nobody got it. Okay. The root for Jacob's name could also mean cheat. Twice in the Genesis story, Jacob cheats his brother Esau of his birthright. But the storyteller is a little bit ambivalent in this story. He doesn't seem to come down heavy on either side here. Does Jacob trick or cheat Esau? Or is the blame on Esau for despising his birthright? Yes, Jacob is a cheat. He is a heel. He knows that his brother is in a weakened state. Esau has been out hunting all day long. Now he is hungry, and the story tells us he is not just hungry, he is famished. And Jacob shows little familiar or brotherly love, and to me he seems cunning and devious. I don't like him. On the other hand, as we heard from Deuteronomy, a birthright was considered an honor in the culture. Much more so than we may care about it today, a birthright carried on the name of the family. It carried the honor of the family into the next generation. It was not something to be treated lightly, and it certainly was not to be sold for a bowl of red lentil stew. And so the storyteller judges Esau for this. Now, Esther Ben, a working preacher, has written, the unexpected ascendancy of the youngest son is a common pattern in the Bible. It is Isaac, rather than his older half-brother Ishmael, who remains the focus of the Abrahamic covenant. So Isaac superseded his older half-brother Ishmael. It is Jacob's son of his old age, Joseph, who sees his dreams fulfilled when his older brothers bow down to him in Egypt. David is the youngest of all Jesse's sons, yet he is anointed king by Samuel. And when his elder brothers cower in fear, the boy David emerges as the amazing victor over the Philistine giant Goliath. These stories are not irregularities in the biblical narrative. It's not unusual to read a biblical story like this one, in which the youngest son has risen to prominence, contradicting the expectations, laws, and conventions of society. The nature of the God of Abraham is to contradict the expectations, laws, and conventions of society. It is the great reversal. This is a theme of the entire Bible. We say that Jesus of Nazareth is the incarnation of the God of Abraham. Jesus is God made flesh. And Jesus most certainly contradicted the expectations, laws, and conventions of society. Particularly as those expectations, laws, and conventions served and still serve to marginalize groups of people. Think of them in the gospel story: the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the lepers. Moreover, Jesus explicitly stated this reversal when he said, "So the last will be first, and the first will be last." You see, Genesis is but one book in the Bible whose purpose is to reveal to us the nature of God. We read the Bible, and I preach the Bible each week because the church, which is not just the United Church of Christ, but is the whole church with a capital C, considers the Bible to be a revelation of God. The Bible reveals God. And each story in Genesis has revealed to us something about the nature of God. And the nature of the God of Abraham is that the weak and the marginal, like the youngest son, become the surprising means through which God works not only in Israel, but in the world. The God of Abraham doesn't choose perfect people to do God's work. We don't have to be perfect to be called by God. The God of Abraham contradicts expectations, laws, and conventions by working through the weak and the marginal. God calls flawed people like Jacob, like you and me.